Thank you and good morning. Thanks for joining me here so early in the morning. My topic today, of course, is about the Pacific Ocean, which is a pretty big drop. And those of you in the front row, I promise not to get you too wet. But or we can all get up and cheer whenever you feel like. Of course, I'm a sailor, and I worked on various ships, and particularly I was captain of a research vessel that was specifically made for shallow water coral and plankton collection and research. So we sailed with our sail rig so we wouldn't disturb the sea and the life right below us, so that we could go and gather with special nets and bring it in and not run an engine, essentially. So we would trawl long courses across what we call the coral triangle, which is between the Great Barrier Reef and western Pacific areas where there's particularly rich sea life. And so I'm going to just show you some of the aspects of this great ocean, which is, of course, many of you have either are living on it or have crossed it in various places, but it is unbelievably large, of course. And so I started by stitching together a picture from Chile and then New South Wales, because most people, when they think of the ocean, they think of the beach, just the shore, and the sound of the lapping waves and all of that. But in between, as we well know on this ship, this is what we see on every other day but today, perhaps. And the vastness of the Pacific is sort of one of the things that is hard for people to understand until they come out here or spend a long way across it. And it had many a name depending on where people were. Here in Polynesia, it's called Moana Nui. Chinese, it's Taipingyang, the great peaceful sea, and which it generally is compared to some rougher parts of the world ocean, I'd say. And then, of course, in European languages, we call it the Pacific, which was named by Magellan when he crossed out of the Straits, and he came out on an unusually calm day into the Pacific, and then he crossed it, and then the world was rounded, and they could understand that really half the world almost is crossing across the Pacific. He had charts that imagined that it was much smaller by the knowledge of the time. And at a certain point, he was out in the middle of it. He couldn't find land. They were running out of food. There were almost 99 days without sighting any land. And at one point, he threw his charts on the floor and he stomped on them, saying, "It's all not true. We'll never find land again." Well, fortunately, they found they landed in Guam finally, of all faraway places. But back in the days of sail, this was often a one-way trip and a great challenge to come down here. Nobody went to sea for pleasure, as Sam Johnson said, and many a sailor again got marooned or lost. And so this is an area where the San Fernando Islands are off the coast of Chile. They're very rough, but that is the site of the classic Robinson Crusoe story of a sailor who gets stranded on the tropical isle. And so this is a kind of an iconic, let's say, an experience for sailors. Have to understand that some days you just you have to go to the bar because you're not going to get any further today. So this is the iconic. Nothing ever happens around here, but he took a shore excursion he shouldn't have, I suppose. Well, anyway, of course, our knowledge of it is based upon the cartography of Captain Cook. I'll speak about it specifically later, and then filling out the knowledge of this vast ocean. And as Melville said, that the ocean, the Pacific Ocean, it makes all of our lands and shores mere islands. And so we think that we live on a continent, but actually every piece of land is essentially an island, however vast. And then when you come out into the Pacific, you have this vastness with, again, innumerable islands and a great distance. But I was struck by something that Bill Mackey said yesterday, that we living in the Pacific feel that is our common connection. And that echoes the saying of Homer, who said, "It's the land that divides people, the seas connect people." And so here you have this vastness that I discussed, how the Polynesians managed to cross this entire ocean and settle people on islands going back in the days when it was an innumerable stretch of time and space to go. And this particular, this is not really a photograph, it's a composite view of just how big the Pacific is. And Robinson Jeffers, the writer, he called the Pacific the great blinking blue eye of the earth. And in World War II, he wrote, but what it sees is not our human wars. So the ocean is sort of the passive presence that we all get to visit and have some experience with, but nobody can quite contain it all. And the other curious thing about this view of the great blue eye of our planet is that paleogeologists imagine that, or they speculate that perhaps at the formation of the Earth, when it was a molten mass getting formed, that the moon was ejected and tore away by the forces of the time and became what we know as the moon up in the sky. But it may have actually left from what's called the Pacific Plate, which is the oldest tectonic plate on the planet, and it covers much of this part of the world. But there's no way to really prove that except by maybe more advanced exploration on the moon and subsea. So you have this great Pacific Plate, which all the continents and islands are, let's say, shores to it. And it is primarily static in its center, but it has the motion and the tectonic forces on its edge. So the Nazca Plate, the South American Plate, and other ones are moving. And in the eastern Pacific, there's the world's longest oceanic ridge, the Pacific Ridge, which stretches about 25,000 kilometers from the Alaskan shores all the way down toward Antarctica. And that is still expanding, just like the mid-Atlantic plate. And parts of it are fractured. You can see the different fractures crossing the Great Ridge. And that's also a point where they have more seamounts, volcanoes, earthquakes, the Ring of Fire, which I'll get to. But the coast of South America is a deep subducting trench where the plate is going under the continent land and rising the Andes. Back in, again, hundreds of millions of years ago, the Amazon River used to run into the Pacific, but because of the subduction, it picked up the mountains, and now the Amazon runs into the Atlantic. And then leaving seamounts, like this is the Easter Island, Rapa Nui, and you can just see how deep this is in meters. So you have a 3,600 meter deep, and then a rise that's a tremendous mountain coming up just for the tip of it being the island. And these forces are still making motion. So you can see Easter Island is slowly going toward the east. As I say, the Andes are still rising, and this is, of course, a zone with a lot of earthquakes, alas. And then as you go up the Central American coast, you have, again, the Galapagos Islands and the Cocos Islands that are seamounts, and then the pressure on the land is rising up, new volcanoes, and of course the mountains that continue up to the North American coast. In, again, very early history of the planet, Central America was not there, and the Atlantic and the Pacific actually had flow through, but as the mountains were risen into dry land in Panama up through Mexico, that had a very major climatic change, which they say led to the desertification of North Africa and the Sahara Desert. So this is the changing, living Earth. And of course, it makes for very dramatic land in Costa Rica and up in as you go up the coast. Some of you, I know you've been to the Galapagos. In Spanish, it's the Archipelago de Colón. But that's a remnant of, again, a great sea mountains that have been rising and subsiding, and but they're so isolated. They have of course, their endemic animals and marine life, which is a great international attraction just to go out and see that. And of course, it's the site of Darwin's investigations that led to his theories. But I'll just, let's say, take a continued tour of the neighborhood. As you go up the North American coast, you get these deep fracture zones, the San Juan and other points. Again, it's very active with volcanoes up the coast of British Columbia, the Cascades, up to Alaska. And this was unknown, of course, when the first Europeans came. Here's a example of a Dutch map from the mid-1600s, and they had yet to understand where all this land went, but it had the California Peninsula further north that was not known, and of course we know well that that's another active geological zone, and you have the threat of different earthquakes and such, but it's been projected again by the paleogeologists that that land will, the California Peninsula will slowly break off on the San Andreas Fault and begin to move north, and then in 25 million years you have Los Angeles right near San Francisco, and then as it goes on, Los Angeles will move north of San Francisco, and eventually it'll be part of Alaska. And so I just give a little financial advice. If you're buying property in California, be sure to read the fine print about the next few million years, because your view may not be the same. Well, anyway, then you come up to Alaska and you have, again, the great Aleutian chain and the trench of the plates, and then you have the rather shallow Bering Sea. And again, this is volcanically active and very dramatic up there. Then you have the Bering Strait, which is only 82 kilometers wide, and you can see the island in the middle, and then Kamchatka across that great peninsula off of Siberia. This is a very dramatic place. Sometimes this ship will cross over that way too, and from Alaska going to Kamchatka, then down to Japan. Very rough and treacherous seas, actually. I was once on a smaller vessel where we had to take refuge behind one of the Aleutian Islands, and the seas were so big that we almost fell into what's called a hole in the sea, where the waves were so big and they part and a ship can actually fall in. And at that point we decided we go to someplace pleasant like Polynesia. Why were we up there to begin with? I mean, every year fishing boats disappear by that. They just get into the right sea condition and there they go. And don't have time to put up an alarm. We won't have that problem today. And then as you go down the coast of Japan, and then you're in the great western Micronesia islands and the chains that go up Saipan and up to Guam, and then down to Irian Jaya and the other islands, down the Solomon Islands and down to Australia. This is, again, a whole vast area, but it is distinguished by, again, different seamounts, and then the deepest trenches on Earth, the Marianas Trench, which is some 7 miles deep, 13,000 meters. So this is sort of the goal of many an adventurer has been to go down there. But it's created, again, by the motion of the tectonic plate. So if we are in Australia, if you're very sensitive, you can feel Australia slowly moving north. Are there any Aussies here? Aussie. Yeah, well, just got to hang on to your beach chair so you can enjoy the motion of the planet. And you see the Hawaiian Islands and even the Tahitian Islands are slowly moving to the northwest. And we're coming down into, well, Fiji, Tonga, then down to New Zealand. That's where the great Tongan Trench is, which is, again, one of the world's deepest. And it is, again, a plate subduction lifting up more land in New Zealand. But the scale of this is quite remarkable. You can see Mount Everest poised next to the Marianas Trench. So this is one of the undersea, let's say, the reverse of mountain climbing. And the researchers have been going down in it for many years. This is the first U.S. Navy sub that went down, not all the way to the bottom, but you may have seen in the news a couple of years ago, James Cameron, the filmmaker who is an oceanographic explorer on his own, he made his own capsule, and he now holds the world's record for the deepest dive of an actual human. But it's basically a sort of a submarine that would just go all the way down to the bottom and then come back up, and he spent a great deal of effort and expense on it. Then he gave the capsule to Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute for further studies. But when you go down there, you see all kinds of life at the very bottom of the ocean. And unfortunately, you also have the debris of humanity, plastic, fishing nets, different things can be found all through the ocean, even at the very deepest place. And you have the most unusual creatures on the planet here. This is a fish that is transparent like they often are down there. And you can see what that fish is thinking. Why do these humans have such bright lights? That's what they always say to each other. And armored fish that date from, like a swimming dinosaur. Others like this telescope octopus that I believe is appearing soon in a new Disney movie. They speak English, these octopus. But anyway, here, the Tonga Trench, you can see in the dark blue, goes all the way down to New Zealand, and then we have the Tasman Sea, the Coral Sea, and so we're actually going over very dramatic ground, as we call it on a ship, but unfortunately we can't quite see it. I mean, some ships are putting in submersibles and glass bottoms and things like that, so you can see some of it, but I don't trust a ship made with a glass bottom myself. I'd rather be in a wooden canoe. But here we have Tasman Sea in New Zealand, Australia, and that's a particular sea where you have great contrasts in temperature, which then make it a very rough sea. But on this particular illustration, you see New Zealand actually has a great continental shelf, and this has been called Zealandia. And with the Tasman Sea in between a number of seamounts, Norfolk Island, other islands there. But if the seas actually were falling, New Zealand would gain so much territory that it would be have a lot more room for all of us visitors. But you can see how much the continental shelf extends out. And so this is the heritage of New Zealand, that they may have a lot more land someday. Just like when your house in Los Angeles moves to Alaska, you could invest in an undersea property in New Zealand. Anyway, all of this is made by this great forces of the earth that bring up magma, and the lithosphere, which is the dry land that sort of floats on all of that magma, and then it goes into trenches, and then it comes up in volcanoes. And this is the topography of the Pacific, like it is in the world ocean, the Atlantic, etc., that there will be a hot spot, it'll raise a seamount, it'll raise a volcano. But in the Pacific, they have this remnant of the original plate of the primordial Earth, which they call in French a guyot, and this is sort of a mesa and a 6,000 or 2,000 meter depth of the water, and then a risen plain that's again above the abyssal plain at the very bottom of the ocean. Well, here's just a couple of views in the Tasman Sea of Lord Howe Island, which is a nature reserve. Maybe some of you have been there. This is a very dramatic island area, and I believe they only allow 100 people a day to go there, just because they don't want to build on it. It has some rare birds and sea life and marine protection. This is the famous icon of that island group, the ball pyramid, named after a Navy officer who first sighted it. But again, it's a place that only a bird could possibly perch on. So then as you go around the Pacific, you have this the famous Ring of Fire. So there's volcanic activity that stretches all the way around the plates, and then they make for constant earthquakes and volcanoes in a lot of places. In the subsea, you have these volcanoes will be spewing out very hot lava, steamed, heated water, but this creates a mineralization of the water, and the current spread it around, and this, in a sense, is the beginning of the food chain. However difficult it may seem, life lives on those fumaroles. There's a kind of a anaerobic bacteria that processes the sulfur in the water and then gets embedded into you see on the lower right, the red worm that has a kind of a hemoglobin. It has the bacteria in it, and then it makes its own life in a symbiotic way. And then it's fed on by the little crabs and shrimp that live down there in the complete darkness. This is of interest because they think on other planets there may be that kind of life that is symbiotic and live in extreme circumstances. But even these days, the volcanoes are coming up and making new land. There's in Tonga, there are a number of new islands. Now, we're not planning to go to that one because we may get there at the wrong time. And of course, this happened off of New Zealand. The White Island, volcanic island, blew up while there were visitors on it, and that was a recent tragedy. But this was just a view out of somebody's veranda the other day down there. And of course, it's an example of the living Earth. Islands sink and then they pop up again in this kind of a spectacle. The most volcanoes in one localized area is actually in Kamchatka. There are over 70 active volcanoes up there, and so this was a volcanologist's paradise to go up there and see it. But because most of them are also covered in ice, and sort of like going to Iceland, and you get this dramatic fire and ice together. But just again, this recent time, the volcano in the Philippines, Taal, exploded. I happened to be there last year overlooking this rather tranquil lake with the volcano in the center, and then ba-boom. And now that whole area is covered in ash and evacuated, and they think it's settling down. But this is, let's say, the most dramatic sort of a view of the volcanic activity, which has just happened this last couple of months. So you'll want to keep your distance from this. And this is the volcano that is the center, or rather the oldest volcanic feature on Easter Island with a rim around there. And that is where they had the Birdman cult for the people of Rapa Nui, where they would have an athletic competition. The men would go from that rim down, climb down the cliff, swim off to an island, get the first laid egg of a certain seabird, and swim back, climb up that ridge, and then the winner would be the representative of the clan that would be made the ruler of the whole island until the next year's competition. It makes far more sense than the electoral college or parliament. But anyway, I was up there hiking again last year, and I didn't win the race. Oh well. Well, we're mostly familiar with this great chain of the Hawaiian Islands, which again are a hot spot on the bottom of the ocean, and they keep, as the plate moves, new islands are made. So you have Diamond Head and Waikiki, that's one of the old volcanoes. You have the coast of Kauai and the Pali that are, again, dormant volcanoes. But on the big island, you have still active flow, and then this is the geodesic service of expected possibilities of some lava flow, which of course has happened. I had friends who just evacuated. Their house was completely overwhelmed by lava, and one year you go there and the next year you can't go there because of this active volcano. And of course that kind of activity goes all the way over to the North American coast with this again, forces that create fissures and eruptions and earthquakes and all such. The very largest of the fumaroles, which here is spewing its sulfurous heated water. It's called Godzilla. It's some 120 feet high. And again, it may last for a long time, but it may also collapse on itself. And then out in the abyssal plain, you have these very deep waters where they have accumulated what they call sea snow, which is organic material from life on the surface that comes down onto the surface of the ground, where for maybe 1 million or more years it will slowly gather minerals out of the water, and these are usually nodules which have a high nickel content. So this has been a matter of debate and a UN resolution to try to understand and then regulate any deep sea mining. The Japanese government has sent out the first mining vessels to go to have some trawlers or remote operated vessels to go down and pick them out of the seabed. But other nations have not signed onto that agreement, and that's one of the issues on the law of the sea and the conferences at the United Nations. Well, then our more immediate effect are all these earthquakes that happen all over the Pacific. And so almost every day there's one somewhere, and there's a lot of attention paid to them because of the threat of tsunamis, because an earthquake in one part of the Pacific will sweep across. One of the most active areas is in the Krill group between Kamchatka, Russia, and Japan. And of course, tragically, Japan has always had this problem of a sudden, what they call a harbor wave, where the water will go out and it'll come back as the great tsunami. And when it happens even in the coast of Chile, the wave will travel about 500 kilometers an hour. So that will pass over the sea without any warning system. And it is no problem on a ship. You just sort of rise with the larger swell that you probably don't even notice because it's so big. But when it comes to shore, that's when it breaks like a wave that has tremendous devastation. This is Hilo, 1946, where this fellow standing there was swept away along with about 158 other people. Nowadays, we have deployed internationally the tsunami warning systems that are buoys that will then broadcast a signal warning and a satellite service so that the warning will go out around the ocean. Now they put the same system in the Indian Ocean. So this is where a little bit of knowledge and preparation will save a lot of lives. And construction to defend the land from this is actually in Callao, Peru. Now I'll talk a little bit about the currents, because the way the Earth moves, these currents will sweep clockwise in the northern hemisphere, counterclockwise below. And I don't have one of the animations of that you can see online. They don't often read, so I'm just give you the drawings of them. There are countervailing equatorial currents around the equator. So by sailing instructions, you would usually follow the currents and the winds that are often similar to cross the ocean and get around what are the great areas in the center North Pacific and center South Pacific where there's very little wind, very little current. And so that's where in a sail vessel you can spend your many a month out there hoping for wind. This is an illustration how the Humboldt Current comes up the South American coast, and then you can ride that over across into Polynesia, which is, of course, famously done by the Kon-Tiki of Thor Heyerdahl. And then underneath the immediate surface is this great conveyor belt of the hydrocline, they call it, of the cold water falling down to the seafloor and then going along around all the land masses. And so even Atlantic water that is fed by the Arctic off of Greenland will come down all the way to the Pacific, and then then the waters will rise up, be heated, and the warm waters have a similar pattern that sweep around the world. This is, again, of major interest to oceanographers because if there's a change in the volume and the circulation of the oceans, it'll change the climate even more. So there's a lot of research about the temperatures, the salinity, the other aspects of the ocean water that are being monitored so we can understand what is going on today so we might predict what may happen. But when you're out here in the middle of the Pacific on a clear day, life seems pretty pleasant as long as you have enough bars on board and enough hors d'oeuvres, I suppose. But it's been said by some meteorologists that if there was no land on Earth, the weather would be somewhat static like it can be in the South Pacific, because there's no land to create contrary forces of wind and currents go here and there, so that if you're out here on the average day, you will have evaporation pick up, form clouds, you'll have a afternoon squall, you'll sometimes quite violent, but it's not really a big storm, it's sort of a spot squall, which can be very dangerous to especially a sailing vessel. And you've been on the ship to see this phenomena already, where it's beautiful for one moment, and then you get wet when you're on deck, or you get even wetter if you're in the swimming pool. And so this is again a pattern that is somewhat predictable. But as you go to the Southern Ocean down south and to the North Pacific, these forces begin to gather into very big storms, very big waves. We've had already the feeling of that swell that came from a cyclone that was up in the northwest of us, and 1,000 miles away we felt that swell yesterday, which is why we couldn't land in Rarotonga. But the biggest waves actually come and sweep over into southern South America, the Chilean coast, Patagonia. That area gets incredibly rough weather down there because of the Southern Ocean that spins around Antarctica has no land to stop it, and therefore it does this kind of wave action. So you have the highest wave swells in the world down in off the coast of South America. Also, you have rain patterns, which are mostly in the tropical belt, but you can see here that you have tremendous rainfall all through Indonesia, up to the Philippines, and then just the neighboring Australia is, of course, one of the driest places on Earth. So again, if the ocean currents change, this is all going to be different, and we hope to understand or prepare for it. You similarly get these big storms in the North Pacific that'll cross over. They will batter up the coast of Alaska, and you have not so much a cyclone, but you have just the vast areas of the depression that then put tremendous rain onto the coast of Alaska. And this is a common phenomenon. All the oceans have the cyclonic low pressure effect. They're called hurricanes in the Caribbean, and typhoons in Asia, and there's cyclones in India, but they're all the same phenomena. And a lot of them will begin in the tropical zone, and then they will build, and then when there's land in the way, that's when the devastation is done. There are not that many in where we are in Central Pacific. But now they're having more of them, and so even places that never knew the destructions of a hurricane or a typhoon are now getting that. And it's often sort of an unpredictable quality that we all have to be aware of. A number of years ago, I was on the Harmony, and we were on our way to Japan from Hawaii, and we had what's called a white gale, which is hurricane strength winds when it was a sunny day. The actual center of the storm was, again, maybe 1,000 sea miles to the north, but that put a swell that was running 20 to 30 feet, and then we had a combined wave, not really a rogue wave, but the rhythm of the wave, sometimes they'll top off each other, and we had a wave break over the entire ship. And I was up on the bridge, and the whole bridge was washed out, and well, every ship needs a good bath now and then, but there's a lot of damage on the top decks, actually. They had never been hit by a wave like that. But we carried on, no interruption to the food services. And then I mentioned the Tasman Sea has this great contrast to the tropical waters in the north, and then they come down and they're mixed with the cold waters from the Southern Ocean that are sweeping around Antarctica. So that extreme temperature difference creates a lot of turbulence in the sea, and even the biggest of ships will have a very hard time pounding against it at the right time of year. Well, we'll talk about that more when we get there. The other phenomenon in the Pacific is El Nino, which again is a temperature variations and a cyclical change in the temperature of the ocean, that it becomes colder in the tropics, warmer in the higher latitudes north and south, and then this will create a heat bulge. Sometimes called a blob in the oceanography, because you get a body of water that is very hot, and then it comes, this is sort of an enhanced view of it, that it'll go from the Central Pacific and then it'll go to the South American coast. They call it El Nino because it would happen around Christmas. And then there's the reverse, La Nina, in other years. But this is, of course, again, studied because it has affects the climate not just of South America, but actually around the world. And the Pacific Ocean is so big, it almost has a vibration, almost you could call it, and a turning of its forces every 10 years. They call it the decadal oscillation. And so the currents will reverse, the temperatures will be in contrast, and then all of the sea life is often left somewhat stranded because their ecosystem will be different. Now I'm going to just talk a bit about the life in the ocean. Of course, the base of it is all this plankton, zooplankton, phytoplankton. Either they can move like an animal or else they're passive like a plant. Some of them are sort of in between, but much of that is fed by runoff from the land or else sulfurous mineralization of the water. And so you get, particularly in cold waters, you get great blooms of it like you have up in the North Atlantic and the North Pacific. You don't have that much in the Central Pacific. It's sort of too warm, and sometimes it is sort of a desert with not much plankton. But it blooms at times, again, with the temperatures and the currents. And so at certain places, at certain times, you can actually see it in the water. In this case, you could see it from the out in space, this gathering of it in the Tasman Sea. And these are all very microscopic creatures. There's some now we know about 5 million different ones as microscopic creatures that are then fed on by the jellies and then the chain of all the other creatures that live off of the filtering and then off the other creatures in the great food chain, such that it'll create this incredible variety of sea life. And we go see what we can see, but in every speck of water there's a world into itself. And that, of course, is what gives the ocean its basis of the krill, which probably by biomass the creature that is the largest in biomass on the entire planet and is fed on by whales and such. Then you have all the other creatures that are dependent upon that chain of life that begins with the plankton. This is a reef shark in Hawaii, which is kind of rare to be seen. And of course, we're going to Australia, and then we will, if you continue on the ship, you go to the Great Barrier Reef, which is, I'm sure many of you have been there. This is the world's largest reef and has now a lot of distress because of the rising temperatures and some of the predators. Then if you go other places like Palau, you have these hillock-like islands that are particularly beautiful. And we've already seen plenty of this. The fringe reef around atolls or else higher mountains like in Tahiti or where we're going in Fiji. So that this is what gives these islands so much beauty, is that they'll have sea life and then mountain life, jungle life, and but above all, they're hotspots for biodiversity. And so all around the Pacific, they're trying to save by making marine reserves so that they will not suffer the fate like in the Philippines, where most of the reefs have been damaged or destroyed by dynamite or poison fishing. And so Fiji and others have been trying to make sure that there'll at least be areas that are protected enough so that they will be the seed for the survival of all this myriad of life, but also be able to continue after maybe the human era has passed, and they will be able to adapt. Just coral alone, there's thousands of varieties of this. It's actually an animal that has a algae in its gut that helps it live. And there are soft ones and hard ones, and ones like this, the antler elkhorn corals. And we saw quite a variety just the other day. One of the great predators now, you may have read, is the crown of thorns, which has been the great monster that's been eating up the corals in the Great Barrier Reef. And they send divers down to catch them and take them out, but they're the ultimate nightmare for the coral reefs because they just chew their way through and they have no predators themselves. Here's another kind of a coral, which was a deep sea red coral, which is prized for jewelry actually, but a fishing trawler pulled this piece up off of actually up in the Bering Sea. There's cold water coral like this. And then in the warmer places you get mangroves and kelp beds that are, again, where a lot of life is spawned and lives. And again, this has been, unfortunately, they harvested to make ice cream and other additives for food or used for fertilizer. Now they're trying to protect what is left of it, particularly in the California coast up to Alaska, because again, the life comes out of the symbiosis of the plants and animals in this area, and you get otters and other life that is dependent upon all the other life. So if you take out the base of the ecosystem, the rest of it suffers. And even turtles, we're trying to protect them, but often they go out in the sea and there's not enough food, or they get entangled in plastic. And so the troubles of the sea you can hear about so much, whatever species it may be. Even if they're protected, they still have a real problem because the imbalances of the ecosystem. And I won't go on about it, but of course whales are let's say the iconic fauna of the sea. And in the Pacific, there are whole groups of them that are only in the South Pacific and others that are in the North Pacific. And only a few species are truly pelagic around the world. This is one of them, the great whale shark, which is neither a whale nor really a shark. It's just a very big fish that feeds on plankton, and it wanders around all the oceans. But again, they're being hunted in South Asia as other fish stocks are declining dramatically. So even this is an older chart of the estimated amount of all these major sea mammals especially. And even if they're protected, I said the real problem is this, the predators that come and take all the fish. And in the Pacific now, this is a very big problem because many of the independent islands have sold their fishing rights to the fishing nations, particularly the Japanese and the Chinese in the Pacific, and that's led to the creation of more of these marine reserves. So President George Bush made the proclamation many years ago now of the northwestern Hawaiian Islands is all no-go, no visitors, no fishing, and so that's, again, considered a place where the sea life will thrive and survive. The other major one is, of course, around New Zealand and Australia. But in places where we will be going, now there's not enough fish to feed the local islanders. And so this has led to the kind of action of the sea shepherd and eco-terrorism, that are pirates, you might call it. But the real problem is the predator fish. And of course, this is the vessel that Steve Irwin went out on, and or named after him, I should say. But that was in Melbourne, where it had safe refuge. But it's considered the Japanese have been fighting back, literally ramming and shooting at the sea shepherd activists. Of course, there have been problems and extinctions before. In the fossil record, you have great sea dinosaurs. Recently, the Dunkleosteus was found. That was about 5 meters long with a very fine set of dentures. And then there are other sea creatures that, they're out there, we know, but we just can't catch one. I don't know why. She just didn't give me her number, even though I was near. And there are other things that probably will go extinct eventually because they will outlive their usefulness. And someday this will be a wreck on the bottom of the ocean, and somebody will say, "What was that all about?" But nowadays we have the real serious problem, all the garbage in the water, and you have a great toll on the fish and the bird life. And there are programs to try to pull it out or restrict the use of fishing gear. But you've all heard about the great garbage patch out in the center of the Pacific, and there's one in the Atlantic. And then you have the problem of the air pollution coming across from industrial areas, particularly what the Chinese say is the chemical warfare against the planet, because every day the coal generation, also out of India and other major population areas, send measurable air pollution all the way around. But notice where the air is really clean, where we're going. And of course, that's, let's say, a refuge from the rest of the world's troubles in a way, these places. But even on an idyllic Pacific island, now you have the almost inevitable problem of sea rise that is now washing out islands. And right where we're going to Fiji, they have made areas where they will resettle some of the Kiribati or the other islanders that have low-lying atolls, and they just have to move somewhere. But they don't want to leave their home, but their home may not be there, or any livelihood cannot be made when you have no fresh water or land. And so this is another serious problem for cartoonists especially. Global warming, a threat to cartoon cliches. And here's another one. We both knew this day would come, Samantha. I'm leaving you and taking the kids. But anyway, it's a beautiful ocean, and there's a lot of places and a lot of human joy that is associated with it. We're all drawn to the sea, and as some would say, the sea is forever starting and restarting. And it drives truth into humans like salt, as one said. And here's someone who also said, he that would learn to pray, let him go to sea. And of course, in Polynesia, this great nautical vast nation with its great maritime history is calling. And if you haven't seen the movie, the most interesting thing is that the water itself is a character, and it comes up and helps the young woman in her adventures. And so it's a living force, particularly in the traditional cultures here. And of course, Polynesia has given us the great gift of surfing and other sports, paddleboarding. I see that all over the world now. That is a traditional Polynesian transport and pleasure. And so this is where the ocean becomes a palpable part of ourselves. And thus, we would like to understand it and preserve it where we can, and of course we use it so much. But my colleague Jean-Michel Cousteau said here, you protect that which you love. Thank you very much, and see you at sea.